There we go. All right, so we're going to get started. Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for joining us today for our Women in Science Winter Speaker Series. We're really excited to have you with us today. This is actually our third session of our speaker series. And a little background, these speaker series are designed to highlight numerous leaders in science and education who have established themselves as specialists in a variety of fields. So my name is Rebecca Hauser. I'm the Education and Outreach Specialist for the Hudson River Estuary Management Program. Today's webinar is being recorded, so if you would like the link to today's presentation, feel free to reach out to me afterwards, and I'm happy to provide that for you. And at the end of Laura's presentation, we'll leave time for questions and answers. So if you have any questions, just put them in the chat. And also just a reminder to mute yourselves, please, during that presentation. So today I'm thrilled to welcome Laura Heedy. Laura leads the Conservation and Land Use team at the Hudson River Estuary Program. And this is through a partnership with Cornell University's Department of Natural Resources and the Environment. She has more than 20 years experience working to advance biodiversity conservation in the Hudson Estuary watershed through innovative programs in conservation science and community engagement, developing new partnerships and contributing to New York State policy and planning initiatives. She earned her Master's of Science degree in biology with an emphasis in ecology from Idaho State University, and also holds a BS in environmental science from Rutgers. So it is my pleasure to welcome Laura.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. Yeah, thanks to everybody who have joined today. And Rebecca, I really appreciate the invitation because it's kind of a unique opportunity for me to be part of the series, talk to a different audience, and also talk about a number of things that I've been thinking about and working on, as Rebecca said, for more than 20 years. And so, yeah, so I'll just jump right in. And in case you're just joining us, you're in the right place if you came to listen to getting the word out on habitat fragmentation. Let salamanders do the talking. So let's see, I'll go to my next slide. So for today's presentation, I'm going to give you a little bit of background and context for this work. And then I'll also talk a little bit about what is fragmentation, or better yet, what is connectivity. I'll share some highlights of our amphibian migrations and road crossings project, and then end with some outcomes, and we'll have a chance to hopefully answer some questions. So we'll start with the background and context. So first, as Rebecca mentioned, I'm with the Hudson River Estuary Program, where I'm the Conservation and Land Use Program Coordinator. And the Hudson River Estuary Program is a watershed program within the State Department of Environmental Conservation. And we focus on the estuary watershed and the estuary portion of the river. And we follow a 5-year action agenda that serves as our strategic plan, and it outlines a lot of measures of success that we're all trying to implement. And collectively, all of our teams at the Estuary Program are working to achieve 6 key benefits for the ecosystem, as well as the people who enjoy living and visiting the Hudson River Estuary watershed. So a little bit about the watershed. The watershed is the green area on the map, and the tidal portion of the river extends all the way up to the federal dam in Troy. And that is about 153 miles from New York Harbor all the way up to the dam at Troy. And that watershed area that's in green on the map is approximately 5,000 square miles. And one other or two other important features that relate to today's topic is you might be able to make it out on the map. There's light gray boundaries overlain on the green, and those represent all of the municipalities that occur in the watershed. And there's about 260 individual cities, villages, and towns all in that area. And I'll talk about that a little bit in a few minutes. And the Hudson Valley, I'll refer to the estuary watershed as the Hudson Valley in my talk. The Hudson Valley is the most biodiverse part of New York State. When we look at different vertebrate species, it's really remarkable. And with today's emphasis on amphibians, I thought I would share that of all of the species of amphibians that occur across the state of New York, 85% of those species have the part of their range in the Hudson Valley. So we have a tremendous stewardship responsibility to ensure that this biodiversity continues well into the future. And part of that strategy is thinking about conservation and land use, which I'll talk about. So our team at the estuary program includes myself and Christine Vanderlyn, my colleague, who's up in the DEC's Albany office, as well as our newest team member who just joined us last week, Penny Adler-Colvin. And we're all extension staff through DEC's partnership with Cornell University's Department of Natural Resources and the Environment. And we're responsible for this goal of protecting priority lands and waters in the estuary watershed through land use and conservation planning. So I'll just unpack that a little bit. So it's protection of priority lands and waters. So that requires some science to know what are the priorities. And the other piece is that we're doing this through land use and conservation planning. So it's not like we have this unlimited bank account to go out and buy all the priority lands and waters. And if you remember in that watershed map, there's a whole lot of different municipalities, all who have their own interests and stake in land use. And so what we do is work within that land use context. And we do that through this approach of developing science-based data and decision-making tools to increase everyone's understanding, including ours, of what the priorities are for Hudson Valley conservation. So things like we have a forest condition index, for example, that we developed in partnership with the New York Natural Heritage Program. I'll share some other tools. And also have our Hudson Valley Natural Resource Mapper, an online mapper where you can go and access all sorts of science-based mapping data. But it's not enough just to have these resources available. We also need to make sure people know that they exist, how to use them, and why it's important for everybody to be at the table for thinking about biodiversity conservation. So our team delivers outreach and trainings, technical assistance. We also manage Hudson River estuary grants through the DEC, all with the goal of increasing awareness of all those biodiversity priorities and also increasing the capacity of municipal officials as well as conservation partners like land trusts to advance science-based land use planning and to achieve meaningful conservation outcomes. And I know that sometimes some of the attendees of the Women in Science series are students or early career professionals. So I wanted to just share that, with today's focus on science, one thing I learned when I started doing this work about 20 years ago or so is having a foundation in science and understanding science is so critical to this work. But also, if not equally important, when trying to change how people think about nature or think about their role in conserving, in this case, the amazing biodiversity in the Hudson Valley, is the need for skills in other disciplines like social marketing, the idea of influencing behavior to achieve a common good, in this case, conserving this ecosystem that we all share, but also having skills in community engagement and facilitation, and probably most importantly, communication skills, right? Like how to frame the message, how to hook your audience. Maybe it's with a smiling salamander face, and then hopefully ultimately to be able to figure out how to influence behavior and behavior change. And so that's kind of a little background on how, while my background is in biology and ecology, as Rebecca mentioned, there is a component of social science to this kind of conservation work as well. So I apologize, I didn't realize I didn't display, but this two-pronged approach kind of at what we do of developing science-based data and then delivering that and making it useful to build capacity of decision makers. And the key decision makers we're working with include a lot of municipal boards, planning boards, environmental commissions, land trust staff, and so forth. Okay, and just one example of a tool that our program developed to help others recognize what the priorities are in the Hudson Valley and kind of have this collective shared vision for conservation is our Wildlife and Habitat Conservation Framework that was published in 2006. I can't believe it's almost 20 years. And it identified significant biodiversity areas that you can see on that map. And this was one way to help local communities and others involved in planning locally think about how do we fit into this larger regional biodiversity priority. In some cases, they'll have local priorities for biodiversity, but they might also be part of a larger landscape. That's a priority. And these significant biodiversity areas aren't regulatory in any way, but they were meant to provide like a blueprint for thinking about conservation at larger scales that where we really want to avoid things like fragmentation, which I'll talk about. So the approach that we encourage municipalities to follow, which is pretty traditional in conservation planning, and land trust will use this approach. Other conservation organizations will use this approach. And the idea is first, you need to know what you have, and then you need to set priorities, and then you can cater the right kinds of planning and policy or other kinds of tools that can help you conserve those places. So for example, we'll work with communities to help them inventory their resources using some of those science-based data that we have. So things like, forests, wetlands, streams, aquifers, watersheds, wildlife habitat, all those kinds of inventory items are an important way of a community thinking about what they have. And then they need to pair that with understanding what their community cares about. So they might have priorities related to maintaining beautiful views or farmland or drinking water or having floodplain protection for preventing property damage from flooding, for example. So kind of pairing up those science-based tools with what the community cares about, they can then develop and determine what steps are appropriate for the community to conserve its priorities. So we'll help communities go through this process in our team's work. If we're successful, some of the outcomes that we will achieve include things like planning boards at the local level having some standards for assessing habitat before they review or approve a new development project, having communities develop those inventories and then using those to develop things like an open space plan or a connectivity plan, and I'll be talking about connectivity today, and so forth. And there's different even local policies like local wetland laws that can be put in place. And we also consider ourselves successful when those plans and policies support not only, again, those local community priorities, but also regional biodiversity priorities, as well as habitat connectivity. So things like maintaining large core forests, intact stream corridors that are well connected to their floodplains, wetland complexes that have a variety of wetlands in close proximity to each other, also source watersheds, and also thinking again about landscape scale conservation. And I'll just use this as an opportunity to share that our estuary grants that we offer annually have had connectivity planning as an eligible project. And some of the examples of projects that have been funded include Columbia Land Conservancy's Taconic Headwaters Conservation Plan, which looked at connectivity within a watershed. The Hudson Highlands Land Trust spearheaded the Green Corridors Plan, which looked at connectivity in the Eastern Hudson Highlands and Putnam County. And those two programs or projects are completed, and those reports are available online. But in addition, currently the town of Bedford is pursuing, and that's the map on the right, they're pursuing looking at connectivity in their own town to try to establish where there's important wildlife corridors and to use that to inform conservation overlay policy. So it's exciting to see these are the kinds of projects that we'd love to see happening throughout the Hudson Valley. And if you want to learn more about this, I would just encourage you to check out our conservation planning in the Hudson River Estuary Watershed website. If you go to the conservation planning tab under inventory and planning, we have a whole section on connectivity planning. But I would encourage you to explore all the tabs, including natural areas and biodiversity. And we have a whole library of resources, and the website is there, and we can make sure we get that in the chat too later. So one of the challenges to this work is the idea that most land use decision-making at the municipal scale happens at the site plan scale, right? So a planning board, a group of volunteers meeting for very long meetings, maybe twice a month, they will receive a plan for a project that's on a site plan. And oftentimes that might be as far as they look, and they may consider what's beyond the boundaries, but typically planning doesn't consider the fact that natural systems span property and political boundaries. And I was on the planning board in my municipality many years ago, and when I was interviewed for that position, I was reminded that planning boards don't necessarily plan. They make a lot of decisions about different subdivision plans and site plans, but they don't necessarily have time to actually do the kind of municipal scale, intermunicipal scale, watershed scale, like large scale planning that really is necessary for biodiversity conservation. Just want to double check. Okay, great. Thank you, Christine, for putting in our website. So one of the questions that we need to think about in our work is how can we foster local land use planning and policies that actually can support habitat connectivity. And, and then as extension staff that are talking to communities and putting out different kinds of publications and tools, how can we actually increase the understanding of habitat fragmentation, the threat that it presents, and then compel decision makers and residents to preserve and restore connectivity? Because just as two examples of impacts of fragmentation, here we have a wood turtle that was unable to pass through a culvert that was connecting a stream under this road. The culvert was actually not effectively connecting the stream, and the wood turtle had to go up and over the road, which is very vulnerable. And the other picture shows how this little tiny vernal pool basically has lost all upland habitat around it due to development. So let's take a deeper dive into what is fragmentation, or better yet, what is connectivity. So let's pause for a minute. I'd love to hear just one word, or maybe two words if you want to put in the chat. What comes to mind when you think about fragmentation or habitat fragmentation? You don't have to write a definition. I would just be chopped up, exactly. Bisected. Roads, roads, roads. Yeah, loss of wildlife. Split, development, oh, squished. Isolation, absolutely. Barriers, little pieces, things are separated. Habitat loss, definitely. Roadkill, unfortunately. Yes, this disconnection. Disconnect is a big threat and a big result. Loss of connection, encroachment, irresponsible. Great. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that isolation again. So let me get into some of the definitions of fragmentation or habitat fragmentation. So fragmentation is the process by which the natural landscape is gradually altered, developed, and subdivided, isolated, like somebody pointed out, until only patches of the original habitat remain. And in this photo, you can see, or in this illustration, you can see on the left, we have a large intact natural area, and the dark green represents the high quality habitat in this patch of habitat, whereas the more disturbed edge is in the lighter green. And on the right, a road bisects that patch, creating two patches that now have smaller areas of that high quality interior forest habitat in this case, and more edge habitat along each patch. And, you've probably have experienced this yourselves. I think about the difference if I, go into a forest preserve, say maybe some park owned by Scenic Hudson or a land trust, or if I go deep into the Catskill Preserve or into the Hudson Highlands, into those forests where it's very different, right? It's darker, it's quieter, you're not exposed to the light disturbance and the noise disturbance that you feel at the edge of a forest. And also a lot of times the edges are where you see more invasive species that you don't necessarily see in the interior of a higher quality forest that has less influence from those from the edge, kind of the access to the edge by invasives settling in and being comfortable in those disturbed areas. And so, drivers of fragmentation can include many things. Some of you capture that in the chat, residential development, commercial development, energy development, transportation networks. Our communities need to grow, and they need to move about the landscape. And so the hope is that we can do that in a thoughtful way that enables us to minimize the amount we need to do, that we need to fragment the landscape. If we look into, some of the consequences when we think about wildlife and why habitat fragmentation is bad for wildlife, fragmentation reduces habitat quantity and quality. And so I talked a little bit about this idea, but when we look at the interior habitat there, that's what we call like core habitat. And that's where some wildlife feels most comfortable nesting. They feel, and they are safer from predation, because a lot of times predators will hunt along the edges of forest patches. So when we have loss of core habitat, we lose some interior habitat species that really rely on kind of a minimum threshold of patch size. And so there are some species of birds you might be familiar with that really thrive in those core patches, species like ovenbird and scarlet tanager, for example. I know when I'm deep in the woods and I get a glimpse of a red scarlet tanager, it's very exciting. And I don't necessarily get to see that, for example, in the hamlet where I live in Ulster County. Also, when the forest patches are broken up, wildlife that is in the interior is then closer to those borders that have lower quality habitat. That's called edge effect. And with bird species, that's where cowbirds might go in and parasitize the nest and lay its own eggs in the nest. It's also where there's often, again, like predators that are comfortable in more developed areas, like a raccoon or skunks kind of wandering around the edges looking for prey. Again, there's also usually more invasive species. And the other problem with these smaller patches is that depending on how they're fragmented, the wildlife populations within those patches can then also start to become smaller and more genetically isolated. And for some wildlife, as you pointed out, the fragmenting feature itself can pose a risk. So if it's a big road or a railroad track or something like that, that can cause mortality for some wildlife species that move across these fragmenting features. So let's focus on the positive. What is connectivity? Because that's what we're really trying to preserve. And ecological connectivity was defined by the UN Convention as ecological connectivity is the unimpeded movement of species and the flow of natural processes that sustain life on Earth. And so some of the benefits of connectivity include that it maintains viable populations of species over time, because, a population living in a certain area may have impacts from disease or environmental change, things like that, that require maybe to be able to shift and move or repopulate areas, and having a connected, continuous landscape can enable that. Also, species just need to move to fulfill different aspects of their life needs, whether it's going to a certain kind of habitat for foraging and then going to a different habitat type for overwintering, a different habitat type for when there's extreme heat or drought conditions. And so connectivity enables those kinds of movements to happen. On a larger, kind of broader scale, the intact landscapes that result from having good connectivity also enable natural systems to shift in response to environmental and climate change. And so one of the things that we're seeing is, ranges of species that maybe were more southern starting to shift up northward due to increasing temperatures. And if there's major fragmenting features, those shifts might not be possible. I would also add there's benefits of connectivity for us humans also, and our human communities. Things like improved quality of life when we have large intact natural systems that are well connected. It often results in opportunities to access recreational trails, beautiful scenery that brings in economic values to our communities. And it also increases our community's resilience to effects of climate change. So again, I mentioned as an example earlier, having streams that are well connected to their surrounding floodplains, that can help us accommodate the increasing flows due to flooding and after intense storms. Also, large forests help us to adapt to intense temperatures, and it also helps to restore groundwater by having infiltration of intense rains and so forth. So many benefits to connectivity. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about how connectivity is often defined. There's functional connectivity, which is kind of how much the landscape actually allows for the movement of organisms and processes. And this can include things like breeding migrations, like I'm going to talk about breeding migrations of amphibians today, seed dispersal, genetic exchange. The challenge with functional connectivity is we actually want to know, is it functioning? And that requires a little bit more in-depth data-driven measures to study that. So things like radio collaring animals to see how they're moving about the landscape. Can they actually get from point A to point B? It also might be using camera traps, for example, or taking genetic tests. So it's a little bit of a higher intensive scientific endeavor to understand functional connectivity. So oftentimes we'll use kind of as a way of assessing connectivity, we'll look at structural connectivity, and that's the physical relationship between elements of the landscape. And so it might mean, looking at things like the GIS data that we have that shows us where large forests are, where water bodies are, stream corridors, and so forth. And it's not unusual for using structural connectivity to estimate where connectivity is through computer modeling and mapping, as opposed to on the ground studies. And I'll give you two examples. Well, first, just to point out, right, that the goal is to have both form and function, right? So we want an intact physical landscape with unfragmented habitat that is able to be supporting truly functional ecological connectivity. And so here are two examples of how mapping has been used to estimate, connectivity. One is a 20-year-old project that was led by the Nature Conservancy for the state of New York, looking at matrix forests. These are large contiguous areas of forest, and also the linkages that were the most permeable parts of the landscape that would connect to those large forest cores. And that was a statewide project that's available to view on our mapper. And then, I forget, it was probably about 10 years ago, we collaborated with a postdoc at Cornell to provide the opportunity for a municipality to have a connectivity map that was scaled not at the state, but at a scale that was useful for local planning. And Red Hook had applied to get that help, and we were able to generate this map of linkages for them to use in local planning. And so again, we didn't go out and actually track species and figure out, we didn't get to ground truth this, but the idea was this could help inform their planning along with all of the other mapping tools that they use. And then just for a graphic, you may have seen this before, but this is another way to think about fragmentation. And I mentioned earlier that a lot of planning boards, right, they're thinking about individual houses, they're thinking about individual subdivisions, and it can really change the face of a large forested area. And without knowing ultimately that there's going to be all these slow incremental changes, it's hard to see that end game of fragmentation and really losing and destroying any kind of remaining forest habitat that's there. And I'll give you another example here. I imagine a lot of the neighbors, the people living in these neighborhoods in this air photo on the right, which I think it was somewhere in southern Dutchess County. I just grabbed this air photo at one point. When you're living in one of these communities that is backed by forest, you might think, oh, we live in a really forested area. Or even when you're driving on a road that looks forested. But if you were to take this aerial view, you would say, no, it's actually very piecemeal. And what we have is a lot of these fragments of forest that have a lot of edge habitat where the habitat quality just isn't great. So I just want to return to that question that I posed earlier, is how can we foster local land use planning and policies that support habitat connectivity? And so this is where we let the salamanders do the talking. And so cue the ambassadors, the smiling ambassadors of forest, wetlands, and habitat connectivity. So you can imagine if I always use this example, if I was to hang up a sign and say, come listen to me, I'm going to talk about habitat fragmentation and connectivity, you might be like, well, yeah, I was going to catch up on Netflix tonight. I might miss that. However, if we let the salamanders do the talking, often people will show up and they're interested in learning about salamanders, the migration. And so that's been kind of this kind of communication strategy, as well as having an impactful conservation project. And I'm going to talk about this project. So this is the Amphibian Migrations and Road Crossings Project. So the impetus behind this project, in addition to wanting to spread the word about the importance of well-connected habitat, is also because there's these incredible amphibians that inhabit the Northeast, and they are reliant on habitat connectivity because they live in the forest and they breed in vernal pools. And I'll just tell you that the photos on this slide include, in the upper left, the spotted salamander. In the upper right is the marbled salamander. The lower left corner is the Jefferson blue spotted salamander complex. I know we said we're talking about salamanders, but we can't forget wood frog, which is another very charismatic woodland pool breeder. And then I also included four-toed salamander. This is a tiny salamander that isn't necessarily always associated with the vernal pools, but they migrate, and they're seen rather in pretty high numbers the same nights that our vernal pool breeders are out migrating. And they're a high priority species of greatest conservation need in New York. And so we'd like to make sure we mention those as well. And the other four species, the spotted salamander, marbled salamander, Jefferson, blue spotted salamander, and wood frog, they all live in the forest. And then they move to vernal pools, probably in a few weeks to breed. They're only in the pools for maybe a couple of weeks, and then they go back to the forest where they live the rest of the year. And so it's not enough to protect vernal pools if we want to protect these species, because they live in the forest. And so we really need to think about habitat connectivity for this group of species. And I'll just say vernal pools are not only important for these particular amphibians, they're important for a whole suite of macroinvertebrates that live in the pools, as well as different larger animals like turtles and even birds that come in and forage in the pools. So they're, it's a big part of the forest food web. Again, this idea that these species need a habitat complex, this is an example of wood frog research out of Maine, where Aram Colhoun from University of Maine has been looking at the need for these amphibians to move about the landscape, and they have extremely complex habitat requirements that we think about them needing upland habitat, but they might also go to a swamp or a forested wetland at certain times of year. And then they also, again, use the pools for breeding. And this requires them, to be able to move across the landscape. And some of these species of pool breeding amphibians, they will travel 750 feet up to 2,000 feet. There's a whole range based on the different studies that have been done in different states. But the bottom line is, they're small and they're traveling quite long distances. And the other challenge here, I think this is on my next slide. Is that, the good news is when we look at different land trusts in the Hudson Valley and even in the state of New York and everywhere and throughout the Northeast, and state forest preserves and state parks and so forth, in those cases, there might be adequate forest sizes for these migrations to happen safely deep in the forest. But in many cases in the Hudson Valley, we're seeing that these migrations are needing to cross roads. And the other challenge with this particular group of species that migrate in late winter, early spring on these quote unquote warm, rainy nights, right now they're all hunkered down in under the ground, or the wood frogs are frozen in the leaf litter or maybe under a rock. Their adaptation to get to these vernal pools as early as possible is what triggers them to kind of all move in what's known as an explosive migration. They're considered explosive breeders. They all want to get to the pools at the same time. So I failed to mention, this schematic is not to scale, but the idea is that a lot of them are moving all at the same time and the same few nights in the season, and then their movement back from the pools to the forest a little bit more dispersed. But during these migrations, there's so many of them moving at the same time that even on a low traffic road, there can be very high mortality because they're cold. I don't have any photos of it in my presentation, but I've photographed the migrations for many years now. The Amphibian Migration Project, we're entering its 17th year, and I used to go out look for migrations before that. I have a lot of photos, I realize, of wood frogs with their front feet underneath, kind of curled under. And I think it's because they have just so recently defrosted out of their little frozen state. They can start moving within hours of defrosting. Their heart start beating within an hour of, or after an hour of defrosting. And so they're so cold and they're moving across these roads where they're very vulnerable. So they can really cause local population declines if there's significant road mortality for some of these complexes of pools where there's breeding amphibians. And the other thing, I still need to reach out to my Department of Transportation friends and ask them for a real accurate number, but I kind of did a quick back of the envelope type calculation at one point. And, there's approximately 20,000 miles of roads in the Hudson Valley. And so what you're seeing is, these kinds of situations like the air photo on the right, where you have pools, you've got lots of forest around, and these amphibians are needing to move from the forest to those pools and back again. And then let's not forget, before the pools dry up in the summer, the juveniles that have now, the frog tadpoles have turned into frogs that are going to hop, and the salamander larvae have turned into adult salamanders with legs, or juveniles at least with legs that are going to become terrestrial. They all then also need to move across roads. So there's a lot of risk associated with these migrations. I will add, because road mortality and habitat loss aren't the only conservation challenges for this group of species, climate change is another. In this pair of photos, we have a pool that's on the left that this was in the Hudson Highlands. This is a pool that dried out like it normally would in a typical year. They do dry out, which is why they don't have fish, which is why they make great habitat for these amphibian nurseries. And the pool on the right shows just a typical kind of frost-covered pool with a margin of water that's open on the sides, and amphibians will go into the pools even when they have that just a moat of water around the sides that are available for them to get under the water and start this breeding as early as possible so that they do have their young leave the pools before they dry out. But so they're so tightly wired and so closely associated with these hydro periods, the amount of water and when it's available to them, that when we start seeing erratic weather patterns, which we've seen, I've seen it where we've suddenly had an unusually warm day that might trigger an early migration, and then a couple weeks later we have a nor'easter, and suddenly there's like freezing temperatures, and not to mention drought is a problem, and less snowpack. I'm so grateful this year we're having a real winter, but the last few years we've barely had any snowpack. And a lot of these pools are filling up just from surface water, from storm water, from rainfall, from snowmelt. So climate change is yet another reason why we should try to make sure we conserve as much of these habitats as we can. So to recap the challenges of working in conservation and thinking about these kinds of species is, there's a real need for habitat conservation. There's a real need for habitat connectivity. There's a general lack of awareness about the importance of all of this, and not for lack of interest, but lack of awareness. There's many decision makers in the Hudson Valley that are all making their own decisions, and I probably didn't provide a full explanation of that, but if you're not from New York State, you might not be familiar with what is called home rule. And basically that is that each town, city, and village in New York has their own authority to make decisions about land use. So that usually is in the form of a planning and zoning board. So there's so many different decision makers. And when we think about conservation across large landscapes and across property boundaries and across political boundaries, it really requires coordinating all these different decision makers, and that can be challenging. And as I mentioned, there's many roads. So again, cue the charismatic amphibian to kind of get the word out. And so that was part, again, of the byproduct of the Amphibian Migrations and Road Crossings project, was the chance to get people thinking about and actually experiencing for themselves what habitat fragmentation looks like. And so the project goals include raising awareness about vernal pool and forest habitat, about Hudson Valley biodiversity, and the impact of land use on connectivity. And I'll just give you an example. We have a DEC delivers bulletin that you can subscribe to receive updates about the migration. I put out some reports about the progress of the migration and also share some natural history. And that DEC Delivers list has been growing slowly over the years, but we have probably about, I think about 2,500 subscribers. And I know maybe only a fraction of those subscribers are actually volunteering from year to year, but the rest are learning about this. So that's one way, we can raise awareness, for example. Another goal is just to provide a rewarding volunteer experience and give people a chance to really connect to nature. For the most part, the average person doesn't go out on a 40-degree night in the rain in early March, unless they happen to be driving somewhere and they see the migration. For the most part, this amazing, remarkable, explosive migration happens without us knowing. And so when people get out and they get to see maybe 8 species of amphibians, including, 9-inch long spotted salamander, it's pretty thrilling to get to have that connection to biodiversity. Another goal of this project is to locate road crossings. Again, with all those thousands and thousands of miles of roads, it's not like there was a map that existed of where these road crossings are. So volunteers are enabling us to find where those crossings are. They also directly can reduce road mortality by helping move amphibians across the road. And that's going to help us identify where are there opportunities for conservation. And I'll talk about that too before I wrap up today. I also hoped that these data that are being collected can be used as a foundation for other scientists asking research questions and investigating some of these species and habitat questions. And finally, I hope that participation in this project, and this is a great question for any social science researchers who would love to collaborate, would participation in a project like this manifest in our volunteers then maybe going to their town board meetings and listening when their town is interested in maybe pursuing an open space plan to conserve large forests and vernal pools, or maybe passing an overlay zoning ordinance to preserve connectivity. So volunteers of this project, it's focused on the Hudson Valley. They go out and they look for migrations and they survey roads where there looks to be high-risk migration pathways. They record data on weather and traffic conditions. They document the species they see, the numbers of live and sadly of dead, and they also help move the amphibians across safely. So now I'm just going to wrap up with some outcomes and then we can take some questions. So just some highlights, and I have to I apologize. I was not able to get the exact numbers for you with the addition of the 2024 data because we're still just finalizing those. But we've had more than 1,000 participants. There's almost 1,800 individual surveys that have been submitted by volunteers. There's been more than 65,000 amphibians counted, 70% of which approximately have been live. Almost 40,000 amphibians have been moved across roads by volunteers, and that's just what they report. I know that there's volunteers who go out to witness the migration and move them across the road, but don't necessarily share their data. So I think that the impact is even greater. And 20 species have been observed. And just to give you a sense, this is the array of species that the amphibian migrations and road crossings volunteers have observed. And the good news is we're all going out at the right time. The species that we would want to see are the early breeders. There's a lot of amphibians that are crossing roads like in the later spring and summer. Those are not the target or focus of this project. Wood frog, spotted salamander, Jefferson blue spotted salamander, those late winter, early spring breeders, four-toed salamander, we're seeing those species that we really wanted to target. So that's great. And the numbers are really impressive. We have the best volunteers. But getting back to this question that I've posed, but is the salamander carrying its weight in getting out the word on habitat fragmentation? And shout out to Kara Gentry for this amazing photo that she submitted. I think taxi driver fans, hey, I'm talking here. So is the salamander actually helping us get the word out on habitat fragmentation? I'll just give you a couple of highlights. So first, the media always loves this project. So that's just in itself is helping get more people thinking about vernal pools and forests and these amphibians that rely on habitat connectivity. Some of the more mainstream outlets have included Smithsonian with photos from a local photographer from the Hudson Valley, New York Times, WNYC. But honestly, our local newspapers in the Hudson Valley often include articles about this, and that's really a great way to educate. I'd also say that it's the migration and the weirdness of these warm winters also has created an opportunity to talk about climate in a lot of local papers. And so these were some articles based on last year's early migration, which was actually seen internationally. There's a similar migration program up in New Hampshire. They had early migration last year. And even over in Europe, there was an early migration last year. And so it was odd that we were all seeing migration starting in February last year. I also want to point out that there's an amazing network and growing network of AMNRC project partners that are helping us implement this project locally. And they then can use this as a way to communicate with their service area and their constituents to talk about the need for conserving lands that protect habitat. And they also are spreading the word through their own communications. And there's such a diverse group of partners. These are just 3 examples. So there's a municipal level, Climate Smart Rhinebeck has their organizing volunteers, and they have a webpage, and they are communicating about it. A watershed group, the Sawkill Watershed Community, they also are helping implement this project and using that as part of their watershed planning and conservation work. And then we have a number of land trust partners. Welcome Valley Land Trust, thanks to a post they made, it ended up being an article in the Land Trust Alliance newsletter. So the Salamanders and the frogs both are really helping us get the word out as our partners. And I'll just share, as we think about land use planning too, this idea, like lead with the salamander, end with the message. For anybody that used to come to our trainings or lectures about this project, I would ask them on kind of a pre-test, are you familiar with your own municipality's wetland protection efforts? And the majority would say no, they had no idea. And then they would learn about the fact that vernal pools are often unprotected, although good news, New York State is just starting, and the new freshwater wetland regulation updates are starting to also protect some vernal pools. But the good news was that these attendees at our workshops would come back, and their post-test, they would say, okay, after tonight, they did want to go and learn about their municipality's wetland protection efforts. So that's kind of how we would kind of merge the conservation land use planning with the amphibian work. And the final thing is we're trying to figure out, can the volunteer data be used to identify areas in need of conservation for vernal pool amphibians, right? So we now have this growing data set. We've been able to kind of improve the protocols to make the data quality higher. And one of the projects that we started with the experts at the New York Natural Heritage Program 2 years ago, and we're picking this up again this year to refine the methodology and add more data, is trying to figure out ways where we have ways to use the survey points that have been gathered by volunteers. If we have, there's a number of criteria of what we included, but can we use those to then inform what are the likely conservation zones around those areas that are supporting the amphibians that are being seen on the road? So this is a different approach. Typically, the Heritage Program would use a known location of a rare species to then use that to extrapolate what is the conservation zone needed to support that rare species. In this case, we're saying, okay, we're seeing these species in need of conservation on roads with data collected by volunteers. Could it be similarly used to figure out the corresponding conservation zone? So we'll be exploring that more later this year, and hopefully being able to share something from that project next year. So sorry, I know we need to leave room for questions, so let me wrap up. Summary. So first, volunteers can definitely reduce mortality in these kinds of migration projects, and if the protocols are followed, can contribute valuable data that can be used in projects like the one we're pursuing with the Heritage Program. We do have to screen these data forms really carefully, and there are often a lot of questions, so the more careful and meticulous our volunteers can be with reporting data, the better we can use it for those kinds of applications and those conservation application projects. This is not scientifically proven, but I think the charisma factor of amphibians is comparable to panda bears. So hopefully we can generate as much interest around our amphibians as has been generated around panda bears. And I would say these kinds of migration projects, or something similar, could be an excellent platform for raising awareness and education about the issues that you care about. So if it's, rare species, habitat fragmentation, climate change, and so forth. And then finally, will their data lead to support for local conservation initiatives? I'd say stay tuned because that's something we'll still be exploring and trying to document. So that was a lot, but this is what happens when people ask me to talk about things I really get excited about. So thank you. And Rebecca, thanks for, I think you're going to be fielding some questions.
Yep. Can you hear me
Great.
okay?
I do, thanks.
Great.
Should I stop sharing my screen or?
If you want to. My internet here keeps going in and out. So
Oh,
I'm glad
no.
I made you the co-host because no one would be able to hear you. Okay, so we have a question. Is there a map now of identified crossing locations?
Great question. Well, I guess is it public? I'm guessing. And so we don't make it public like on an easily accessible website, for example. And the reason behind that is that there are people with different kinds of goals, and they might collect these amphibians for the illegal pet trade. And that's actually something that has happened. The New York State DEC's environmental conservation officers did do an undercover project years ago called Operation Shell Shock because they were finding people were collecting and illegally selling, salamanders, turtles, snakes, and so forth. And so what we do is when we work with our partners, we share data with them. If somebody was to write me and say, we're trying to start a crossing guard project, we'd be willing to work with them to share the data. We just don't have it publicly available. However, what's good is that project with the Heritage Program that will have conservation zones around concentrations where we know there's a lot. Those will be a nice way to share habitat planning guidance without revealing maybe the specific points where they're being collected or they could be collected. That's always the big question.
I love this message from Alexander. Thank you so much, Miss Heedy. I have to go do my science homework.
Good. I go do that homework. That's great.
I
can't see the chat. Let me pull it up.
Okay. Aaron Snyder, this was so great. Thank you. I hope to volunteer this season. If we attend the virtual training on the 19th, will that have information on local groups to volunteer with? I'm in Peekskill.
Okay. Not necessarily in the virtual, because sometimes we get a large number of people and we can't pair up everybody locally. But what you can do is you can write to our inbox, I'll say, for this project. I would not use that email address. Sorry, this is an old closing. Oh, good. It's not even up on the screen anymore. I would write to, and I'm going to put it in, I'll put it to everyone in the meeting here. It's woodlandpool@dec.ny.gov. And if you are trying to connect with volunteers in your area, we can try to help you do that.
Okay.
And also Peekskill, right? No, okay, yeah, we can talk about. We can look and see if there's any other volunteers down that way.
Okay. Can you speak to how the start of the migration is determined? Is it
Yes,
based
I
on
can.
weather conditions, monitoring, or something else?
Yeah.
And how volunteers are notified once migration starts?
So if I could reach it, I'd show you. I have this crystal ball. No, actually, the way we predict the migrations is based on what has been being observed for years throughout the Northeast, and published in scientific literature. There's like 3 magic criteria: that the ground is thawed, that the evening temperatures remain above 40 degrees Fahrenheit. I have to say though, I think sometimes, like the Jefferson blue spotted salamanders, I think they migrate maybe when it's even a little bit cooler than that. But that's, and then it has to be raining, right? So these are amphibians. They exchange oxygen and water through their skin, and so they need to stay moist. And so you're not going to see them out on a dry night. But we have seen them when the air moisture is high enough that even without rain, they might move. But that's like the trifecta of the conditions. And I'll share with you it's very easy to look at a weather forecast and get a sense if it's going to be raining and warm enough. Whether the ground is thawed has been this like head scratcher for me some years when I don't even know if it ever froze. And one year I got so desperate, I was actually taking a walk at lunchtime behind our DC office and saw somebody was like drilling for a resident. And I stopped them and I was like, hey, can you tell me? I think they were doing something with their septic. Is the ground frozen? And then I also ended up calling a farmer friend. And he let me know that another farmer friend had a bull die and they had to bury the bull. And they said that the ground's not frozen. So I've been creative in trying to figure out whether or not the ground is actually frozen to figure this out. And the other thing I'll say is if you sign up to receive our project bulletins, once those conditions look right, I'll start sending out alerts to let you know that the conditions look good.
And this is a nighttime migration, correct?
It's nighttime. Yep. And what's amazing, because nature is amazing, they go back to the pools that they emerged from themselves. So they go back to their natal pool. So that's why, you know, if you put a road between the forest and the pool, it's not going to stop them from trying to get back to that pool, right? So, so that's just one aspect of their life history that's really interesting. Oh, I see a question I can grab if you
How
want.
many different animal
Oh,
species could you find on average in a vernal pool?
of amphibians or of everything? I mean, there's,
Those animal species.
well, I don't even know the answer to that, but I mean, I could tell you like one of the amazing invertebrates that are considered an indicator of vernal pools are fairy shrimp. That's just one of the amazing species named a fairy shrimp because they seem to magically appear when the pools are really cold in late winter, early spring, and they require that wet, dry cycle of a vernal pool because their cyst, their egg actually needs to dry out and then get re-inundated to hatch the following year. But there's, you know, fingernail clams, there's all different beetles, there's all different invertebrates in the water, you know, there's number of different amphibians, there's wading birds, there's you know, spotted turtles will stop in them, Blanding's turtles will stop over in them. I always used to joke they're like the Howard Johnsons of the turtle nesting migration route because they can stop over, get some shelter, get something to eat, and then continue on to wherever they're going to nest. So yeah, so lots of species. I don't know the full count, but I will say that I don't have it in front of me, but there's a really great guidebook to vernal pool wildlife put out by Massachusetts. I think it's their wildlife program. It's a really nice, handy, small field guide to all the wildlife and insects and everything associated with vernal pools.
Should people wear gloves while handling amphibians?
Great question. What it's not necessary. What people should do if they're handling amphibians is make sure their hands are clean and wet. So they should have no chemicals. Again, their skin is so sensitive. You should make sure you don't have, you know, hand sanitizer, lotion. You shouldn't need insect repellent, you know, during the season that they're out. But if you happen to go to a vernal pool in the summer and you've bug repellent, don't handle amphibians. So clean, wet hands. If you wanted to, I believe like non-latex, non-powdered gloves can be used. I think they're called nitrile night gloves. Yeah.
That's it on questions.
Well, is that right? I thought I saw one other. Amazing. Wow, look at that. It's
Just
4:30.
comments.
Okay, great. Wow. Well, I really appreciate everybody sticking it out to the end and attending today.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Our next webinar is next Tuesday. It's our last speaker with Kim Hill. Same time, 3:30 to 4:30, February 18th. So please join us. We'd love to have you again. Thanks, Laura.
Great.
Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Thank you for having me. Yep. Bye.